It's the Ostrom Avenue podcast, and it starts right now.
Welcome into another edition of the Ostrom Avenue podcast alongside AJ Myers. I'm Jordan Leonard and AJ. Classes have started to end. Have a lot more free time on our hands now.
Yes, and the weather. Come on, I thought you would lead with
The
the weather.
weather,
It's a
yeah,
beautiful day in Syracuse today.
That's kind of crazy by me. I always lead with the weather when it's bad, and then the one
Yeah,
time it's good, for a consistent couple days in a row, I just ignore it.
it's been great outside.
I know it's been great. I mean, we played kickball yesterday. I played some basketball last night. I'm potentially going golfing tomorrow morning, which will be fun. You can't beat it. Finally, in Syracuse, it's so weird. It just like flips a switch when it goes from
hmm
bad to medium to then really nice, like the rest of the way. And Syracuse is really nice. It's so much better than Florida because when Florida gets really
Yeah,
hot, it's very humid. It's very sticky. Syracuse is not like that, which is kind of nice. Although I will say
yeah,
I've struggled with the pollen the last couple days.
yeah. But no, you're right. When it gets really nice here, it's like one of the best places to live. But unfortunately, though, that's only in the summer when all of us leave.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. We got a robust agenda here on the Ostrom Avenue podcast. As always, we're brought to you by our listeners in Empire Hearing and Audiology. We got a bunch of transfer portal news, both football and basketball. We got a player who confirmed he's returning to Syracuse men's basketball next year. And then, of course, women's lacrosse breakdown of what happened at the ACC tournament last week. And Syracuse men's lacrosse is going to the ACC tournament this weekend. So we'll have all of that. But starting with the transfer portal news, we'll start with football just because, football is football and so fun and Fran Brown. Syracuse got Justice Ross Simmons from Colorado State, a wide receiver. AJ, I know you got the stats pulled up on him. How's he done, at his time with Colorado State?
Yeah, he was a number two wide receiver there, 6 touchdowns, 71 receptions. So I think he'll fit in nicely to a wide receiver core that, we talked about it with Emily Liker of Syracuse.com, has some question marks given that SU's best wide receiver or tight end, Aronde Gadsden, is going to be coming back from an injury. So I think it's a really solid pickup for the Origin. I think he'll fit in nicely. He's not going to be asked to do too much. Again, he was a number two at Colorado. I don't think this is like him coming to Syracuse to be like the guy, but he'll definitely be a nice role player. And look, Kyle McCord could throw the ball to, but now it's just who he can throw to. He can throw the ball. It's just whether of who he's going to be throwing to. And this is definitely someone who I think will be of value for Syracuse.
Yeah, I think it's a weird transition when you look at wide receivers. Any quarterback Syracuse had in the last couple of years, you look at the wide receivers and you're like, okay, this guy needs to get separation. They need to get open. That was the biggest complaint when they started 6-0, and then they weren't getting open the rest of the year. When you have a quarterback like Kyle McCord, he can throw people open. Like these receivers don't need to be necessarily get open for them to actually have catches and receptions and all that stuff. So you look at this guy from Colorado State. He was the number two. It'll be interesting to see what kind of jump he can make, but also his big frame. I mean, 6'3". He's a long guy. If he can go up, make catches, he's a big target for Kyle McCord alongside Aronde Gadsden,
Mm-hmm.
alongside Zeed Haynes, alongside Jackson Meeks. Trevor Pena's back, which a lot of people are forgetting to talk about, a nice gadget guy in the slot. This wide receiver core is looking pretty good, and it's such a different feeling because when you look at it again, when you look at it with a quarterback that can actually throw people open, then it's like it changes your whole perspective on what kind of wide receivers you need and how good that wide receiver room is.
Yeah, when you have a talented quarterback like McCord is, it's less pressure because I think last season and even seasons back, we would criticize the receivers. While also at the same time, I almost felt like there was like too much pressure on them to perform when really SU the quarterback wasn't great or was injured and couldn't get the ball downfield, or in Garrett Strader's perspective was always kind of looking to run. It almost was kind of like, oh, you're criticizing receivers so much, but like they're just doing everything they can do. Now I think with McCord, he wants to throw the ball. He'll get these receivers targets and hopefully get them touchdowns.
Yeah, for sure. And a good quarterback opens up the field because you never know whether he's going to throw it short, whether he's going to throw it
Yeah.
long, over the middle, outside. And you mentioned the injury aspect of it. Syracuse hasn't had a starting quarterback go the entire season as the starter in the last 12 years, partly because of injury and offensive line. They actually did get some more offensive line help in the portal, an offensive lineman from Colorado, Savion Washington. He was a higher ranked recruit, so we'll see what he actually can come in and if he gets into the starting lineup. But I think any offensive line help from a Power 5 school, whether it's the transfer they got earlier in the transfer portal window back in the winter. Josh Miller from Georgia, Savion Washington now from Colorado. Any Power 5, upper echelon Power 5 offensive lineman you can bring in, that's just so beneficial for a Syracuse offensive line last year that was horrendous.
I mean, that's crazy what you said earlier. It's been 12 seasons since SU had a quarterback go the whole way. Like, I mean, that's just, I don't think any other
All
school has had
12
a
starts, and
deal.
it's only 12 starts too.
Yeah, I honestly wonder how many other schools have had a deal with that kind of problem. So yeah, I mean, exactly what you said. Any help you can get on the offensive line is huge, especially last season when the offensive line just seemed like every game there was a new injury there or there was somebody new lining up. So that's a huge help. And I mean, look, you have one of the best quarterbacks for Syracuse that you've had in a long time. Top priority is to keep him healthy and make sure he gets all 12 games.
One can argue that Kyle McCord is probably one of the top quarterbacks in the ACC,
Yeah,
and for
exactly.
some reason, every time a quarterback or someone good comes to Syracuse, their draft stock goes down, which makes no sense because he hasn't played a game there
Yeah.
yet. But if you look at it, I was talking to our sports director Tyler Aiken, and if you take his stats last year at Ohio State, and that was a quote down year for Ohio State quarterbacks. That would have been like top 3 in every quarterback statistical category in Syracuse history. So even a
Yeah.
down year for Kyle McCord playing in the Big Ten against Big Ten defenses, also like that was a statistically really good year for Syracuse. Just a little bit more on Savion Washington. This guy's a big boy, 6'8", 320 as an offensive tackle. That's some muscle and some height right there. Potentially coming to the Syracuse offensive line, which should only hopefully enhance Kyle McCord's play.
Yeah, I mean that sounds like a good offensive line kind of mold. So hopefully he stays healthy and can make an impact for the Orange.
Yeah, health is going to be a big key for Syracuse football. A lot of coverage still to come this summer as they get into summer camp. The transfer portal actually just closed on May 1st, so nobody can enter the portal, but people can still commit from the portal up until probably early in the summer. So we'll see what Fran Brown does, see what his plan was when he pitched to John Wildhack to get the job, and we'll see what that goes along with throughout the summer. We'll keep you covered here on the Ostrom Avenue podcast. Pivoting to Syracuse men's basketball, we'll start with someone who didn't commit to Syracuse, Dakota Lefu from Mount St. Mary's. He was a 3-point guy, 6'5", shooting guard that was considering Syracuse. He ended up going to Georgia, thinking to pair up with Frank Anselem. He's actually back in the portal, by the way. But Dakota Lefu doesn't come to Syracuse. Jaquan Carlos, though, a 6-foot point guard from Hofstra, commits to Syracuse. And this is really the point guard that Syracuse needed. We talked about it. They need a guy that can handle the ball, that can, run the pick and roll, whatever you want to call it. He had over 10 points per game for Hofstra last year, 6.3 assists per game, which is crazy in college basketball if you think about it. 4.4 rebounds per game and a 1.6 steals per game. He was a CAA all-defensive team at Hofstra. So it seems like Syracuse got a point guard that can, 1, handle the ball, 2, dish it out to everyone around him, and 3, play defense. I mean, that's a trifecta right there.
Yeah, that should definitely be value for Syracuse. But one last thing on Dakota Lefu, I think Syracuse did everything they could to try and get him. They hired his head coach at his team before at Mount St. Mary's, so they really tried everything they could, but just couldn't seal the deal on it. But I think it's okay. It's not like that's a huge loss because I think the guy they did get is he should work for Syracuse, like you just said. He's kind of the prototypical point guard. I think it'll be interesting to see how he works with JJ Starling. Maybe it's him being more of an assister and then Starling being more of a scorer. But really, something I've kind of been thinking over this last month with all these new players for SU men's basketball is like last season when it ended, I was like, all right, Adrian Autry's not going to have a full second season. He had that first season with a lot of new things. But I think this season it's going to be even more new. I think last year's roster, there was more returning faces than there is on this year's roster. So I think it's almost, I'm getting a little worried. I know Syracuse had to do this because they lost so many players to the portal, but it's almost to a sense now where it's like Autry's going to have so many new guys to put into his culture, put into his system that I'm almost getting a little worried of like how much progress is this team going to make because it's such a new team from the one that played last year.
So I think it's actually beneficial that they revamped the roster, because if you look at it, all those guys like Aquadir, Judah, everyone was recruited to play a zone defense and the Jim Boeheim style. And Adrian Autry's style is somewhat similar on offense to an extent, but obviously the man-to-man defense is a big difference. So I think getting and going out and recruiting talent for the system that he runs is actually going to help make this team better. Yes, the no continuity type, when you lose all those guys and you have to go into the transfer portal and get a bunch of guys, that's not going to help. But I think you look at college basketball now, that's what the beginning of the season's for. It's kind of like an NBA it's kind of like preseason a little bit. Those first couple games, if you schedule cupcake games, that's kind of where you figure out where your team's at. And those losses back in November don't matter as much if they're against better opponents or even against worse opponents coming March Madness, because the talk is with the transfer portal and everyone going everywhere, that teams they just aren't fully formed at that point. So I think honestly the conversation has changed in that way. You mentioned JJ Starling is coming back. He confirmed that on Instagram. I think if you go back to the point that you made about Carlos and JJ, I think JJ has to just be that guy who's focused on scoring. Let Carlos be focused on, dishing out those assists, running pick and roll with Eddie Lampkin, whatever the Adrian Autry draws up, and let JJ just be the scorer. And then kind of circling in all of the men's basketball players that we just talked about, Carlos, JJ, and then Dakota Lefu. I think that's the one hole right now in the roster if you look at it. You look at Chris Bell, he's the shooter, the knockdown shooter, the over 35%. He's going to stand the 3-point line, pass the ball, he's going to shoot the ball and make it. They need one more, because you can space the floor more now with Eddie Lampkin down low. He can post up. You can space the floor with a point guard that can drive, that can play defense, whatever, get you out in transition. Now you need that second knockdown shooter. Justin Taylor was thought to be that going into the year. Didn't end up working out because of the position that he was played at, in my opinion. But if you look at it, you need another knockdown shooter to space the floor. Otherwise, all of that defensive intensity is going to go right to Chris Bell, especially beyond the 3-point arc.
Yeah, and I mean Chris Bell too, just like Justin Taylor, was pretty sporadic last season. I mean, he'd have halves where he'd score 20 points, and then the next half where he wouldn't score at all. So I think that is something they do need to look into. They've definitely been kind of heavy on getting that interior built in with the forwards and now the guards. So maybe this is kind of like the last straw they're focused on, is finding another knockdown shooting forward player. But now I do think Adrian Autry is a big fan of Chris Bell. I think he thinks he has a lot of confidence in him, just the way he spoke about him last season. But I do think, that'd be a lot of pressure on Chris Bell to ask him to be the guy to just knock down shots and be the team's best 3-point shooter, because JJ Starling, shooting the 3-ball wasn't really his strong suit. I don't think that
ever since the shoulder injury freshman year, the shot has kind of just gone away to an extent. Honestly, too, it's not even about putting all that pressure on Chris Bell. It's just balancing the offense out.
Yeah.
Chris Bell can shoot, and hopefully, if you go by progression, junior year, he would get even better at that. And Elijah Moore can shoot. We'll see what he can do his freshman season, but he's a guard. Donnie Freeman can shoot. He's more of a forward, I guess. More power forward based on his size. But you just as much shooters as possible, if you can get on the floor, is what you should do. And Syracuse has the open roster spots. I don't know who's still left in the portal. There's so many players moving every which way in the transfer portal nowadays. Last year there was over 1,000 players in the portal. I would assume it's the same this year. So there's just so many moving pieces, and honestly, you don't know who Syracuse is necessarily targeting unless you get those tweets that they're visiting campus. So I think that's the one hole in this roster, though. You get another shooter, and then yes, you still need to kind of blend everyone together in that culture come training camp and early in the season. But then if you look at the roster on paper, and I know paper is only so good, but on paper it actually kind of looks better than last year.
Yeah, definitely more depth. Last season, there was barely anyone coming off the bench. It was really
talking about Kyle Cup's number 8 guy.
It was Quadir Copeland. He was really the only bench production for SU.
Quadir hasn't committed anywhere,
which is interesting.
It's interesting.
Yeah, bring him back. That would be nice.
You could, but he's not really a shooter.
No,
you just replaced him with and they're different sizes, being Quadir 6'6" and Carlos 6 foot. But Carlos does exactly what Quadir does. He scores like the layups, he assists, and he was a defensive guy. They play a little bit of a different position, but interesting that I think it's interesting that Quadir hasn't committed anywhere yet.
Yeah,
Because the later and later you get, the less roster spots there's open
the
on
less
every team.
options there are. Yeah.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what Adrian Autry's squad does the rest of the summer. We'll also keep you updated on that on the Ostrom Avenue podcast. Noticeably, no transfers have committed to Syracuse women's basketball at all yet. There has not been any real news. Alyssa Latham left. A couple of guards went into the transfer portal as well. You lose Deasia Fair. You lose Elena Rice to graduation. So there's some spots to be filled on Syracuse women's basketball that'll be interesting in the coming months. So we'll keep an eye on that, see what Felicia Leggett Jack is up to and her squad coming off an NCAA tournament berth and a loss in the round of 32. I mean, if you look at it, you definitely need to replace Alyssa Latham. I would assume,
Yeah,
given her production, and she went to she go to Tennessee. I'm pretty sure.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Tennessee, which is a good jump for her. I
Yeah.
still am confused on kind of why she left, but
Yeah. I was shocked.
she's going to
I
be
had
the
a
starting
chance to.
center here again next year.
I know. Yeah. I had a chance to talk to her high school head coach, and like he praised her in her decision to go to Syracuse and thought that was a great fit for her, given her work ethic. And as a freshman, she worked so hard to get in that starting position, and she really earned it. So yeah, I was really surprised that she left.
Yeah, we'll see who Syracuse women's basketball goes out and tries to get in the transfer portal. Speaking of basketball, actually, not speaking of basketball, we're going to transition over to lacrosse because that's actually what's going on right now in Syracuse. Both lacrosse teams are about to start postseason lacrosse. Syracuse women's lacrosse has already started it. ACC tournament was last week. They were dominant for 2 of the 3 games. They dominated Louisville 17-8. They blew the doors off of number 6 Virginia in the semifinals 19-4, and then kind of just collapsed in that championship game against Boston College, lost 15-8. Coming out of the ACC tournament, I'm actually more impressed with Syracuse generally, because if you look at it, Boston College has been their kryptonite for the last 3 years. They've lost now 6 straight. Before this blowout loss, they'd all been by 1 goal the last 3 times at least. So the way that I look at it is Syracuse can beat anybody right now except for Boston College and maybe Northwestern. So if you think about that, that's essentially Final Four. So and then you have to deal with that when you get there. So I mean, people are disappointed that they can't beat Boston College. For some reason, it's a mental hurdle for them. And I agree on that. I still think it was a positive sign at the ACC tournament for how dominant they were, especially that Virginia game. Like Virginia is a top 6 team. They have beaten Boston College this year. And the fact that they dominated them 19-4 is only good things if you look towards the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, they definitely won the games they were supposed to win. And that UVA game was good because last ACC tournament last year against UNC, they didn't dominate them. They struggled, and that's how they lost the ACC tournament. So then, this time around to win those first 2 games, and then I mean, this is crazy, this Boston College thing. I mean, the fact that they can't beat BC is
It's
beyond me. And
crazy.
the first quarter they played well, and then Boston College just took over and just looked like such a superior team. But I think you make a good point. If you win the games you're supposed to win in the NCAA tournament, those first few games should be too much of a problem for this team. And then you get to the Final Four, and then that's when you got to go up against Northwestern, Boston College, and I mean it's just a luck of the draw whether you could beat them or not.
Yeah, Kayla Trainer can't beat her former head coach. She was the offensive coordinator when BC won the national championship back in 2021, I believe, before she ended up coming to Syracuse. And it'll be interesting to see what seed Syracuse gets. It depends on what happens, I think, at the Big Ten tournament. There were some upsets. So Michigan dropped a little bit. Maryland dropped a little bit as well. Assuming Northwestern wins, they'll get the number 1 seed. Boston College would get the 2. And then I don't see a reason why Syracuse wouldn't get the 3. They've beaten Notre Dame head to head. Michigan has 3 losses in the Big Ten, which is the worst conference in the ACC. Then you got, if you're looking at just the polls, Virginia at 6. They blew the doors off
Yeah,
Virginia.
can't put UVA ahead of
Loyola
them.
at 7. They beat Loyola head to head. So, I mean, I don't see why Syracuse can't get the 3 seed. And a reminder, the top 3 seeds get a bye in that first round, so they would only have to win 2 games to get to the Final Four in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I think they deserve it. I think they had a strong end of the regular season, and the hiccup to Boston College, and then the ACC tournament. Again, they won the games they were supposed to win, and they dominated a good UVA team. And then Boston College again. So they should get that 3 seed and then really win those first 2 games and then Final Four.
Yeah, so I actually have a question for you. Last year, Syracuse goes throughout the entire regular season undefeated until that Boston College game, and then kind of they won some games. They got to the Final Four, but it wasn't like feeling good getting to the
Yeah.
Final Four given the results. Do you think this year, because they went through adversity at the beginning of the season, starting the year 3-3, losing to Northwestern, Maryland, and Stony Brook in the first 6 games, do you think that'll help them in the NCAA tournament in terms of not only getting to the Final Four, but potentially somehow either taking down Boston College or taking down Northwestern when they get to the Final Four? Or
Yes, I
if they
do.
get to the
And
Final Four, I don't know
yeah,
why I said
and
when.
Kayla Trainer, yeah, Kayla Trainer has talked about that as well. She said this team kind of went through the rough patch or the early hiccup early in the season, unlike last season where they played their worst lacrosse at the end of the season. It's kind of like baseball, where you want to play your best baseball in September, ride that momentum into October. Syracuse, I think, is playing their best lacrosse at the end of the season, May, April. This is when they're playing their best lacrosse. Yes, they lost. They basically have one team. One team has stopped them. Boston College. Boston College stopped them from an undefeated ACC record in the regular season, and then stopped them from the ACC championship. They're playing their best lacrosse now. They showed that for 1 quarter against BC, and they showed that against Virginia. I think I have more confidence in this team to win the tournament this year than I did last year, because last year it was like they almost were running out of gas. They had some injury problems, and they didn't look like they were playing their best lacrosse to where they were earlier in the season. This year, I think it's the opposite. I think they are playing their best lacrosse. They're going to have some time off, which I think should only benefit them. I mean, that's really never been an issue for this team, and time off and them not getting up to pace. I mean, it's the NCAA tournament. Like, you shouldn't have to, get up to
Yeah.
speed for that. That should be plenty of motivation in itself. But yeah, I have confidence in this team to get to the Final Four. They should. They're talented enough. It's just whether or not they can beat Boston College and Northwestern, 2 teams that have just owned them in the recent years.
Yeah, yeah. And the interesting thing that you mentioned right there, and I'm going to knock on the piece of wood down right next to me, is the injuries. They have
Yeah.
not had injuries this year, which is starking for Syracuse. That's not a word, but startling for Syracuse, because the last couple of years it has been like crazy the amount of injuries that they have suffered throughout the year, and that might have hurt them later on in the year. I mean, they played all the way to the Final Four without Bianca Chevry, without Kate Mashevsky, just to name 2 people, which is your draw control specialist who absolutely dominated the ACC tournament this weekend or this past weekend. And Bianca Chevry is one of your main defensive players down on the bottom of that zone right by the crease. So the fact that they got to the Final Four without them and almost beat Boston College is crazy. Now they're going to have them this year, which I think only helps the experience and all of that. I mean, Kate Mashevsky is winning draws right now at a rate that is insane. I mean, the amount of possession that Syracuse is getting, now they have to take it into the offensive end, and Boston College kind of exploited that in the ACC championship game. But it'll be interesting to see, Syracuse fully healthy going through the NCAA tournament for the first time in a couple of years. And we'll have, all the coverage on WAER Sports on Twitter. We'll be following every single women's lacrosse game. AJ and I will be doing podcasts on women's lacrosse as long as they keep winning. We'll be breaking down that, see what their path is once the NCAA tournament bracket comes out on Sunday night. I believe it's at 9 p.m. and the men's are to follow at 9:30. So stay tuned to that, the bracket coming out this Sunday. Speaking of men's lacrosse, Syracuse men's lacrosse going down to the ACC tournament in Charlotte this weekend. They were off last week. A lot of chaos happened. North Carolina almost secured themselves a bid to the ACC tournament if they could only win by 5 goals.
They didn't know it. They didn't know it either.
That's the craziest part. I was watching that game and winning by 5 goals against Duke, okay. But when you're up by 9 and you don't know that if you win by 5, you secure yourself a spot in the ACC tournament is ridiculous. And maybe they did, but it didn't look like they did from watching on TV.
No.
So they ended up winning by 3. So they do beat Duke, which is a feat within itself. Given they were without Owen Duffy, their best scorer, and Paul Barton, their best defensive player. But because Virginia loses to Notre Dame, Duke is the 3 seed, and Virginia is the 4 seed, Notre Dame the 1, Syracuse the 2. And because Duke lost, Syracuse actually moves up to number 3 in the polls this week behind Notre Dame and Johns Hopkins. So Syracuse takes on Duke again. They played on March 30th, I believe the date was. Cuse.com is not loading for me right now.
No.
It did actually load. I'll get you the right date. It is March 20th. I was 10 days late. March 30th was the Notre Dame game.
There you go.
Okay. They beat Duke on a Wednesday in the Dome 10-4. They absolutely shut down the offense for the Blue Devils. So it'll be an interesting rematch, AJ. Now it's tomorrow for Duke.
Yeah, I mean, that was SU's best game of the season, maybe Gary Gates' best ever game that he ever coached. But besides the fact of the game, I've kind of made my opinion clear with this ACC tournament. I don't like it. And when
Yeah.
you talked to UVA's head coach Lawrence Tiffany, he kind of mentioned it. He would have rather played Syracuse in Virginia. He would have rather gotten two regular season games with these ACC teams like it's been in the past. And I like that better because if Syracuse wins this ACC tournament, it doesn't really do anything because
It
they're
gets them
already
the
going
number
to go
one
to the
seed. It gets them the number one seed in the NCAA tournament.
It could, but it's not
It
an auto
will.
berth or anything.
It total. I mean, if Johns Hopkins say wins the Big Ten tournament, Syracuse would have beaten Duke and Notre Dame, and Syracuse would have beaten Johns Hopkins head to head. So probably would get them the number one seed. I get what you're saying because these two games would generally just be in the regular season anyway.
Yeah.
So Syracuse would have a chance to get the number one seed by just winning the regular season games. Having talked to Gary yesterday, he likes it. I don't know why. I agree. I think it's cool, but it doesn't do anything. Like, why would you have why would you have a ACC tournament at a neutral site?
Yeah,
where
that's the other key thing.
Like
the neutral site.
We'll see what the crowd is like, but at a neutral site, when there's no automatic qualifier, like the person who wins doesn't automatically qualify. And so it just doesn't make sense to me. I get the appeal to it. You know, it's for the best teams in the country in one spot for one weekend, but you're also making teams, well, Duke can probably bust, but you're also making teams fly to Charlotte to potentially play one game and go home. And then if you play two games, say you get to the ACC championship game, you're playing on Sunday night or Sunday during the day, and then your NCAA tournament games are less than a week later on a Saturday, most likely. So for all for no automatic qualifier, it just doesn't add up.
Yeah, and look at the crowd that Virginia game had. Like, imagine if you
That
had
was
Notre
elite.
Dame in the Dome. If you had Notre Dame in the Dome, that crowd would have been, I'm sure, very similar. I know there was the jersey retirement and everything, but I think for a Syracuse perspective, you love those home games, those big home games. You get such a crowd. I think that's so key for this team, and it's going to be interesting, the crowd, because when they played Johns Hopkins, I mean, you were there. There weren't too many people there.
No, there were more Syracuse than Johns Hopkins.
Yeah.
But the stadium wasn't full. I mean, so that stadium, so it's in the same stadium they play Johns Hopkins, like you just said. It's kind of like a bowl, where the press box is on the far side where I was. So the stands there were pretty full, but there was nobody behind us.
Yeah.
There's nobody. And even the sides, there was really nobody. So like, maybe 2,000 fans for a game against two teams that, it's a rivalry. So, we'll see the attendance down in Charlotte. If you look at this game, though, and we'll get into some predictions because I'm actually interested to hear what you have to say here. I think Syracuse is on an uptrend. I think the rest is going to help them, actually, going into this game, especially if you have to play 2 games in 3 days. Having that week off is going to help. I think Syracuse is a great matchup against Duke. If you look at the way they play, they're so, as Gary said, they're so up and down, but they're 3 stars. I think Syracuse matches up really well against on defense. They showed that in the first game. See, I don't think they're going to hold them to 4 goals necessarily, but I think they're going to play another great defensive game because you put Billy Dwan, who's an all-ACC guy, on Brendan O'Neill. You can put Riley Figueres on Josh Sawada, and then Caden Cole on what is his name? Dyson Williams. I should know that. But you put those 3 guys on those 3 guys, and I think that's great matchups if you're Syracuse. And honestly, the offense didn't even play that well in the first matchup. Patrick Jamison was great in that first matchup, Duke's goaltender. So if Syracuse can play as good towards as good as they were in that first matchup, the offense improves, which I think it has since that Duke game. I mean, I think Syracuse matched up great.
Yeah, I mean, that first game against Duke was how this team plays at their best, and they can score more goals. Look at the Virginia game. They have the capability to score more goals.
That was such a fast-paced game too.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we could see something like that again, but I would be shocked if they held Duke to 4 goals. I don't think that's going to happen just because Duke is going to be ready to play this game. Not that they weren't ready to play him before, but especially now, I think that'll be added motivation that they got held to 4 goals the last time out. but I think this is a good matchup for SU. You said the rest will help. I think it will help in terms of just, resting your body and getting ready for, the playoffs. But how will this team start the game? Because we've seen starts
Very
where,
interesting.
look at UNC, where it was like, oh no, like they're about to get blown out here. It was 3-0. They didn't start the game really until the end of the first quarter. And then they've had games. Look at the Duke game. They started that game really strong. So how this team starts the game against Duke is going to be dependent on if they win or not. Because if they're chasing, I don't have confidence when they're chasing a lead and trying to level the score. I know they did it against Virginia. I don't have as much of confidence when if they start a game out strong like they did against Duke, get a commanding lead. Sure, if they let a few goals in, that's fine. But I think that just helps this team so much better when they start off strong, get an early lead, maintain that lead rather than trying to chase a game and almost play like a basketball game like that Virginia game.
That's fair. The North Carolina game is definitely an interesting one just because it was kind of a trap game, if you want to call it
Yeah.
that, in terms of the opponent. So I totally agree. They definitely came out the gate slow. That's an objectable fact. But I think the difference of opponent might change that a little bit. So, I mean, getting to the predictions of it, I think Syracuse finds a way to beat Duke. And then I would assume I'm going to assume Notre Dame beats Virginia just because I don't believe Notre Dame will lose until they actually lose. Because they are just been so dominant the last 2 years. That matchup against Notre Dame is so interesting. If they make the ACC championship, I think they actually win. So yes, ACC championship, baby.
Wow.
I'm drinking the Kool-Aid. Just because so they beat Duke. I think they're a better matchup. They're better matched up with Duke than
Yeah.
anybody else. And then if you look at that Notre Dame game, they got out to such a slow start. They're down 3-1. They were down 12-6, and they still made it a 2-goal game. If they start out any faster, they're in that game or tied in that game, let alone they didn't win faceoffs. Mason Cohen was not 100% that day. They didn't win faceoffs. And they didn't play well until the second half, really. I mean, you look at that fourth quarters where they dominated. So if they actually play an even game, then you take it down to the wire, and Syracuse, has that chip on their shoulder against Notre Dame, I would think.
Yeah, I think they do beat Duke. I think it's a good matchup for them. I think they'll win Duke. I think Notre Dame's going to be a test, but
Yeah.
yes, the Irish have, they've won a lot of games this season. They've only lost one, but they haven't been like dominant. They only beat Syracuse by 2. They beat Duke by just 3. They beat Cornell by just a goal. So yes, they're winning. They know how to win games. They have that championship pedigree, but it's not like they're like blowing teams out of the water. It's not like every game is a complete blowout. Virginia, they just beat them by 2, and Syracuse beat them. So Notre Dame is beatable. Syracuse is talented enough to beat Notre Dame. It's just whether or not SU has the championship pedigree to match up with a team that has done it. That's the key. The mental toughness, their motto, calm is contagious. Can they stay calm against the best team in the country and the team that has just won the title?
Do you think they can? Do you think they
No.
can win the ACC? No?
Unfortunately, no. I think Notre Dame will win.
Yeah. And Notre Dame's one of those teams, like you mentioned, that just they don't win like by a lot, but they are so
No.
veteran that they just
Yeah.
find ways to win, and it ends up being in the win column. I think Syracuse gets it done in the ACC tournament. I think, some chip on their shoulder. Gary's trying to rebuild this thing back to what Syracuse was. I think this could be another step to that. I think the week off will definitely help. AJ thinks they get to the ACC championship and then lose to Notre Dame. Totally valid prediction. I could totally see that happening. I'm just leaning. It's like I'm probably like 60-40 leaning ACC championship because anything can happen in a 3-day span down in Charlotte in a tournament style thing. Either way, we'll have full coverage of Syracuse men's lacrosse for the ACC tournament and the NCAA tournament. Starting on Friday, Syracuse and Duke scheduled to face off at 8. McClure Modeling countdown to face off scheduled for 7:30 in the double overtime until 11:30 p.m. Say Syracuse beats Duke. AJ and I both think that's going to happen. They would play in the ACC championship game against the winner of Notre Dame and Virginia on Sunday. That game's a 12 p.m. face-off, which means a bright and early 11:30 a.m. McClure Modeling countdown to face-off, and the double overtime going until 3:30. After the ACC tournament, whatever Syracuse does, they'll make the NCAA tournament. We know that for a fact after that Virginia game, essentially. That tournament bracket will be released on Sunday night at 9:30 p.m. So stay tuned. We'll probably have a lot of coverage on who the matchups for Syracuse are and what their tournament bracket looks like on Monday. So keep tuned to at W8ER Sports on Twitter and at W8ER Sports Talk on Twitter. We'll have a podcast next week before the NCAA tournament. Hopefully Tim Leonard will join us to talk men's lacrosse and women's lacrosse. You got anything else to add, AJ? It's a busy lacrosse time right now.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, totally random thought here, but what's the trophy look like for the ACC tournament?
That's a good question.
Do they design something new?
I think it's the regular one, like with the little pipe things, whatever.
Okay.
I don't know how to describe it, but yeah, the same one that the women's probably got Boston College got the previous week.
I didn't know,
but it is interesting. They had to
they did something new.
Yeah, they have to remake it. They haven't used it since before COVID. So we'll see what the trophy looks like. Maybe Syracuse will be hoisting it if you follow my lead. If you follow AJ's lead, it'll probably be Notre Dame hosting the trophy on Sunday of the ACC tournament. Again, stay tuned to at W8ER Sports on Twitter and at W8ER Sports Talk on Twitter for all the coverage. That does it for another episode of the Ostrom Avenue podcast. We will continue making weekly episodes until the men's lacrosse and women's lacrosse team eventually lose, whether that's winning a national championship, losing in the Final Four, or maybe even losing in the first round of the NCAA tournament. Then we'll be very fired up if they do that. I could tell you that. So keep tuning in every week, and we'll see you next week.